Hi everyone, this is Hana. Welcome back to my island. In a recent video, when I talked about the pain of the Jeju April 3rd incident, I mentioned that for Koreans, April is a cruel month, right? Because April 16th is the Sewol Ferry Tragedy. This year marks the 12th anniversary. Every year on April 16th, right around the time the cherry blossom bloom beautifully and start to fall, we hold the Sewol Ferry Memorial Ceremony. If you travel to Korea, you might see yellow ribbons everywhere. They are there to remember the 304 souls who took their final trip to heaven together on April 16th. April 16th, 2014, 304 entire universes were lost that day. If the students were still alive today, they would be 30 years old. April 16th, 2014. I still clearly remember pacing the floor in absolute helplessness, watching live on TV as a massive ship sank helplessly into the sea. It was a bizarre and cruel scene where the entire nation had to watch in real time as high school kids on a school trip disappeared into the cold water. The Sewol Ferry tragedy wasn't just a ship sinking. It was more like watching the myth of our social safety net permanently sinking beneath the surface. That was the first time in my life I held a fundamental question in my heart. What is a nation? The other's announcement on the ship, "Stay put," which the kids trusted and followed, became the most shameless lie the state told its people. And it fears the soul of our community. The captain who told the kids to stay put and should have stayed on the ship until the end was the first to escape in his underwear and get rescued. Stay put. That phrase symbolized the Korean society at the time. After the Democratic administration of Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun ended, a former big corporation CEO and the daughter of the 1970s dictator Park Chung-hee took office one after the other. Koreans who had once chosen a bold progressive path eventually chose an every man for himself mindset over living well together during a global economic downturn. I made badges engraved with that cruel phrase and shared them with the citizens who came out to protest, standing in solidarity with them. The young college students Yong Hae-in, who was in and out of police stations for leading silent protests back then, has now become a National Assembly member fighting against the contradiction of the system. My friend, a reporter who lived and slept at Pengmok Port for months, recording the wailing that burst out every time a cold body was recovered, eventually couldn't overcome his broken heart and trauma and left Korea. I too felt deep disillusionment with the system called the state. Right after that, I left Korea and wandered around the remote islands of the world for 10 years, living as a stranger in places that are marked as territories on the map, but are practically in a state of anarchy where survivor instincts kick in before public authority. I observed life without a system. Out there, away from the state's protective net, I relied on a raw order of the ocean and struggled to ease the guilt in my heart. Ironically, the more I tried to run away from my Korean identity, the more clearly I was seen as a Korean by others around the world. Running away wasn't a process of erasing myself. Instead, it became a time to reconfirm the emotions, cultural traits, and unique servant energy inside me through the eyes of others. Things I had taken for granted, like the air I breathed, and never even noticed when I lived in Korea. I crossed the borders because I hated Korea and the suffocating air of this incompetent system. But the truth I faced was a little different. I finally had to admit that I pitied my country just as much as I hated it, and that I loved its tragic vitality and left sorry for it more than anyone else. Love and hate were just the two sides of the same coin. However, on October 29th, 2022, the tragic news from Itaewon called me back to my home country. Seeing the reality where young lives were helplessly lost again in the middle of the city, Seoul, while the trauma of the Sewol Ferry was still fresh, I realized how powerless the escape I chose really was. How much of the promise we made to the Danon High School kids 12 years ago to build a better society has been kept. That heavy sense of that brought me back to this country. The question of whether we are standing on ground that is even one step safer than 12 years ago hits me like a punch to the gut. We often talk about the state or system like a cold machine, but the system is also an organism designed and operated by people in the end. The scene that unfolded when that organism stopped working was horrific. Since I lived in a city right next to Ansan, my friends and I rushed to the Ansan High School memorial altar right away. 304 people. Ansan, where an entire grade of Danon High School simply evaporated, felt like one giant funeral home. The portraits of the kids I saw at the memorial altar were the exact same students' ID photos they probably took with the excitement of the school trip. Rows of 18-year-old kids smiling brightly in their school uniforms. Photos that should have been used for college applications were instead used as their funeral portraits. Later, the final videos recovered from the kids' cell phones broke the nation's heart all over again. Watching those heartbreaking records of them comforting each other and whispering that they loved their parents inside a sinking ship, we had to painfully recall the helplessness we felt the moment that ship disappeared under the water in the spring of 2014. That collective helplessness, where the whole nation had to watch helplessly as the ship sank on live TV, engraved an unforgettable, massive trauma on Korean society. What was even more tragic was the attitude the state showed after that. The Park Geun-hye administration openly blocked the truth-finding investigation to cover up their responsibility for the tragedy and used the state power to spy on the victims' families. They even committed the unforgivable act of secretly backing far-right groups to insult the victims' families. Far-right groups like Ilbe, who had been hiding in the shadow of the internet, started showing their real faces in public spaces around this time. The binge eating strike, where they ate pizza and chicken and mocked the grieving families who were on a hunger strike demanding an investigation, was a symbolic event showing that Korean society had crossed the absolute lowest point of human decency. This was the beginning of crazy movement that twisted reality using hatred as its fuel, perfectly matching the style of far-right populism. The South Korea I knew was quickly turning into a strange, bizarre monster where hatred took over the offline world. On top of these ruins where human dignity was so brutally crushed, we had to find a new language in order to protect ourselves from being eaten by the state that had become a monster. When anger and helplessness tried to swallow us, ironically, what pulled us back to our feet was not the repair of the system, but the warmth of the people standing next to us. Just like Hannah Arendt's insight, the control and force exercised by the state is closer to violence. Power in its truest sense is born only when citizens gather in public spaces, standing in solidarity and act together. The candles that lit up the winter of 2016 were more than just a desire to change the government. They were a massive declaration of rejection by the citizens against the state violence and hate groups trying to destroy our humanity. The state betrayed us, but we confirmed each other's warmth in the public square, and we used the citizen power to fill the empty seat of justice that the system had abandoned. Ironically, the unique Korean DNA I discovered on a remote island where the state was absent was a fierce resilience. We don't always make perfect and right choices, but the moment we realized we made the wrong choice, we are people who know how to hold on to each other and come back to the right path somehow. At the base of this resilience, the politics of vulnerability and mourning that Judith Butler talked about is firmly rooted. On October 29, 2022, during the Itaewon tragedy, the state once again weaponized language to hide its incompetence. To lighten the weight of the disaster, they ordered people to downgrade the tragedy to accident and victims to the dead. They set up bizarre joint memory altars across the country with no portraits or nameplates, trying to artificially erase the faces and names of the victims from the citizens' mourning. They even sparked conspiracy theory by leaking the possibility of drug autopsies on the victims. This was a shameless attempt to erase the state's responsibility by framing the cause of a structural disaster as individual misbehavior or an unlucky crime. It was the violence of power trying to completely privatize the pain and sweep it under the rug. Judith Butler points out that the act of the state defining which deaths are worth mourning and which are not is the most political kind of exclusion. Standing up against this massive power trying to treat specific death as unworthy of mourning, citizens once again chose to come out to the public square and grieve together. To be honest, the public square is the only place left for us citizens to turn to. That's why Gwanghwamun Square is such a truly special place for Koreans. Stubbornly finding and calling out the names the state didn't allow, and sobering like it was our own loss in front of nameless portraits became a powerful resistance in itself. The ethics of citizens lingering in front of others' pain, pointed out by scholar Ji-ho, comes to life right here. Feeling lost and not knowing what to do, yet unable to bear leaving the side of those in pain and just lingering around them. That lingering is the actual safety net holding Korean society together. The state brushes off pain as personal bad luck and ignores it, but the lingering citizens drag that trauma out to the plaza and translate it into a social language called our pain. This ethical solidarity, staying by their side to the end even without an answer, is the only strength that kept us from being swallowed by despair in the face of horrific tragedies and allowed us to take the next step. People in their 50s and 60s in South Korea carry memories of the military dictatorship, the May 18th Gwangju massacre, and the June democratic struggle. They bled, fought against the dictators, and built economic growth with the sole purpose of making sure the next generation could live well like human beings. They were the main characters of an era run by the grand narrative of the state, and they were the last generation to share a firm belief that personal sacrifice would lead to the progress of the community. However, the lives of their kids, the 20s and 30s generation they try so hard to protect, have been an endless series of tragedies. The kids who lost their friends in the Sewol Ferry tragedy as teenagers had to face a massive disconnect called the global pandemic as young adults. After being isolated by social distancing for nearly 3 years, they finally came out of that long tunnel and went to Itaewon to enjoy the Halloween festival for once, only to face a crowd crush right in the middle of Seoul, supposedly the safest city in the world. And this scene too was broadcast live all over the world, leaving another painful collective trauma for Koreans. This cruel timeline, starting with the death of friends and continuing with the death of friends, left an unforgettable collective trauma, especially on the younger generation. What the 20s and 30s generation learned through this process was the realization that the absence of the state is not a temporary accident, but a permanent condition. While the older generation fight against the dictators was a struggle to replace evil power with good power, the reality young people face today is a survivor game within an incompetent system where no one takes responsibility. The cynicism, resignation, and nihilism born from this are completely different from just immature rebellion against the older generation. It is the product of defensive individualism where they have given up hope on the system and only clinging to themselves, data, or visual fairness. What sociologist Kim Hong-jung calls the survivalist mindset is dominating this generation. For those who learn through three massive tragedies, Sewol Ferry, the pandemic, and Itaewon tragedy, that the state will not protect them, the sacrifice or community that the older generation talks about sounds like nothing more than fancy words. Far from inheriting the fruits of high economic growth and the pride of democratization that their parents' generation enjoyed, the young people who have to fully bear the scars and the swamp of low growth left behind now ask the older generation, where is the better world you promised us? All of us, carrying different types of pain in our own timelines, are sharing scars that are still unhealed. South Korea is letting out a massive groan at the intersection of the older generation's pride that they fought for their kids and the younger generation's sense of loss that they were never fully protected by the state. Unless we bridge this gap, we will inevitably be isolated on our own islands, unable to even find the language to understand each other's wounds, let alone stand in solidarity. Korea is a country built on mothers' tears. Out of Korea's 5,000-year history, let's just look at modern history since 1950. From mothers who lost their sons in the Korean War, mothers who lost husbands and children in the Jeju April 3rd incident, the main mothers of the young people sacrificed in the May 18th Democratic Uprising massacre, down to the mothers to the Sewol Ferry and Itaewon tragedies. They were never even given the time to properly mourn before they had to become fighters on the streets. In particular, the death of Jeon Tae-il in 1970 was a turning point that changed the flow of modern Korean history. He set himself on fire while protesting the horrific labor conditions at Seoul Pyeonghwa Market, shouting, "Follow the Labor Standards Act," and "We are not machines." The life of Ms. Lee So-sun is the most noble milestone showing how motherhood in our society can evolve into a massive fighting spirit. Carrying her son's dying wish, "Do not let my death be in vain," she became the mother of all workers and spent her whole life fighting on the streets, standing by marginalized laborers. As feminist anthropologist Kim Sung-rae insightfully pointed out, Korean mothers showing an incredible political subjectification, pulling their private sorrow out of a darkroom and into the public square of justice. For them, motherhood is no longer a passive role within a patriarchal system. It is the most powerful language of resistance, living out the lives of their children destroyed by state violence and waging a war of memory against the power that forces us to forget. When Jeon Woo-won, the grandson of Jeon Do-hwan, the main culprit of the massacre, visited Gwangju, the May mothers warmly hugged him, showing an embrace that goes beyond the resentment. This wasn't simple forgiveness, it was a radical hospitality, embracing even the descendant of the attacker as another victim of history. Their resilience goes beyond healing personal wounds. It acts as a massive social safety net, filling the ethical void abandoned by the state system with the solidarity of mothers. The Sewol Ferry mothers rushed to wherever there was a tragedy, like the Itaewon disaster site and the remains excavation site of the Jeju Air Muan Airport tragedy, holding hands with other grieving families. This is a crossing of memory connecting tragedies from different times and spaces. It's the work of resetting our society's moral standards by never stopping the act of asking why these deaths happen. The courage they show becomes the last fortress, keeping us from giving up on being human, even in the face of the system's cold-hearted betrayer. While mothers on earth hold their rough hands together to support each other's collapsed worlds, we dream that beyond the sky, all those who fade away in tragedy will meet, smile without pain, and live together. Ultimately, the mother's struggle is a desperate and dazzling politics of record, trying to pull that peaceful reunion down into earthly reality. Let's go back to the question from 12 years ago. What is a nation? The answer I found and learned from my own country after a long wandering is clear. The state is just an object that citizens must constantly watch over and guide so it finds its proper place. It is not some savior that will magically rescue us. Over the past 10 years, we have personally proven this harsh reality by impeaching two presidents. Koreans do not trust the lifeless system called the state. Instead of putting our hopes in the power that has always betrayed and deceived us, we chose to believe only in the people beside us and the solid bond of us. The history of that belief was passed down in the public square. During the 2016-2017 candlelight revolution that impeached President Park Geun-hye, who was responsible for the Sewol Ferry tragedy, mothers pushing strollers taught their kids that the plaza is the biggest school. Those kids who grew up listening to the shout of democracy as a lullaby in their strollers ran out to the plaza barefoot and blocked tanks with their bare bodies on the desperate night of December 3rd, 2024, when the government mobilized the military to stage a coup under the guise of martial law. The fighting spirit of these young people who throw themselves in front of guns and knives to protect democracy eventually became the massive driving force that brought down then President Yoon Suk-yeol with another impeachment in 2025. He is now sentenced to life in prison as a ringleader of rebellion. This goes beyond the concept of representative democracy defined by Western political philosophy. It is the perfect example of sovereignty in action created by South Korean citizens themselves. We don't trust the state or the system. We only trust citizens. We trust people. When the system broke down, instead of scattering to survive on our own, the most vulnerable among us willingly stood together and created a massive wave. This goes beyond just mechanically fixing the system. It is an existential decision and a humanistic response to never look away from the pain of the person standing next to us. Korea's democracy isn't just some theory trapped in a textbook. It operates on the ethics of lingering, resonating with someone's sadness and translating that sadness into shared justice. Even in Western society that invented democracy, there is no expert or framework that can fully explain South Korea's modern history. The politics of Jeong, deep emotional connection, and dynamic civic awareness, which Western modernity failed to achieve, have combined. And we are creating our own unique model of democracy that the world watches in awe. The safer society we promised our kids might not be fully built yet. But thanks to the Korean citizens who each did their best to hold on to the string of solidarity, even amid the painful collective trauma, I'm confident that we will never sink. The desperate realization that we only have each other to trust has actually become the strongest anchor pulling the world in the right direction. Only people can heal the deep wounds given by people, using solidarity and hope. Back in my home country after a long journey, I choose to believe once again in the existence of you, standing beside me. The state wasn't there, but you were, we were. So I no longer dream of a remote island. In Korean, we have an expression, 애 끓는다. Here, 애 means intestines. It means the pain is so excruciating that it feels like your guts are tearing apart. Parents who lose a child live with this gut-wrenching agony. Mothers who were already overwhelmed just trying to survive their grief. The state turned them into street fighters. These mothers shaved their heads and went on hunger strikes. They kneel before politicians who looked the other way, crying and apologizing to their dead children. I'm sorry, your mom isn't rich. The state and society that tormented these parents, the most vulnerable people in the world, must have been gripped by some kind of madness. Seeing these mothers at the memorial ceremony today, it suddenly struck me how much gray hair they have won. They were so young mothers 12 years ago. April 16, 2026, the 12th anniversary of the Sewol Ferry Memorial Ceremony. For the first time, a sitting president attended the memorial. President Lee Jae-myung bowed his head to the grieving families, held their hands, and promised, I will protect the people under any circumstances. For the past 11 years, other presidents didn't even show up. They were too worried about the political burden or walking on eggshells around their voters. And today, one mother visited the water where she lost her child and cried.
보내놓고 돼 있어. 너무 잘 살아. 사람 같아서 미안하고 그렇지만 엄마 잘 사는 거 아니거든.
I'm sorry that I'm still here, eating and breathing. I'm sorry I didn't follow you right away. But honestly, my baby, I'm not doing well at all. For a mother who outlives her child, simply taking another breath feels like a sin. Well, that's all for today on Hana's Island. If you like my video, please support me by hitting like and subscribe and leave your thoughts and opinions in the comments. I will see you right back here next time. Until then, rest peacefully on your own island that perfectly fits your own latitude. Take care. Bye.